I was driving my delivery van home from a remote drop-off late one evening, around 11 p.m., with steady rain coming down. Normally, I didn't work this late, but now and then, there'd be a late-night order that had to be fulfilled. The places I delivered to were scattered, so most of the drive took me down long, empty stretches of highway. As I drove, I noticed headlights up ahead, and despite keeping the speed limit, I quickly caught up to them. It was an older pickup truck, crawling along well below the speed limit. It seemed like the driver was overly cautious about the wet road, but they were moving at a pace that didn't make sense. After a moment, I grew impatient and looked for a safe opportunity to pass. I sped up slightly and switched on my signal to let them know my intention, but just before I could make my move, the truck lost control and swerved off the road. I slammed on the brakes and pulled over, remaining inside my van and glancing out the side window. Somehow, the truck managed to avoid hitting several trees, but it had gone down a slope and appeared to be stuck. Even though it wasn't my fault, I felt a sense of responsibility and knew I couldn't just drive off without at least calling for help. I dialed 911, but there was no signal at all. After waiting a moment without seeing any movement, I got more uneasy, so I stepped out of my van and walked over to check on the driver. I made my way down the rain-soaked slope, carefully navigating my way past the trees until I reached the truck. It was wedged between some shrubs, but didn't seem too damaged. Approaching the driver's side, I noticed the window was fogged over, so I knocked before opening the door. Inside was a man who seemed to be frantically trying to start the truck. I asked, "Are you all right? Do you need help?" He looked up at me, silent for a few seconds before responding, "Just give me a ride." I told him I could take him to the nearest gas station so he could call for assistance, but that was as far as I was willing to go. After a moment of hesitation, he agreed. He stepped out, and I led the way back to my van. Despite the rain, he moved slowly and seemed to keep his eyes locked on me. Every time I glanced back, his gaze was fixed on mine until I looked away, which made me uncomfortable. But maybe he was just trying to make sure I wasn't a threat myself. Once inside the van, I started driving, unsure of how far the nearest gas station was, but assuming it wasn't more than 50 or 60 miles away. For the first few minutes, I tried making small talk, but the man barely responded. I thought perhaps he was disoriented from the crash, but it made the ride feel incredibly awkward. Every so often I would look over and he'd be staring at me. No smile, no frown, just watching. I couldn't help but wonder who he really was. Most people in his situation would be thankful for a ride, yet he seemed detached, almost too calm. Luckily, not long into the drive, I saw the lights of a small town up ahead. But as we got closer, the man's behavior became even stranger. He was looking around constantly, both inside the van and outside the windows. When I finally pulled into the gas station, I parked the van and asked if he needed anything else. He didn't answer, but there was a strange tension in the air, like he was considering something. I tried to break the silence. "Okay, well, I'll be on my way now." But just then, the man suddenly lunged at me, pushing me against the door, and began punching me as I tried to open it. Before I could fully react, the passenger door flew open, and the man was pulled away from me. I stumbled out of the van, still disoriented, not sure what had just happened. When I looked around, I saw 2 police cars and officers restraining the man. They didn't give me all the details, but apparently, he'd been running from a serious crime and had stolen the truck. When officers found the truck wrecked by the side of the road, they set up a stakeout at the nearby gas station. They didn't know I'd picked him up, but as soon as they saw him attack me, they moved in to intervene. I'm not sure if he attacked me because he wanted to steal my van or if he thought I had turned him in when he saw the police, but either way, it was terrifying. I knew he seemed off, but I had no idea how dangerous the situation really was. If the officers hadn't been there waiting, I'm not sure I'd be here now. I was making a delivery to a warehouse on the West Coast coming from the Midwest. This route was one I had driven countless times over the past 20 years as a trucker, so I knew it like the back of my hand. Same highways, same rest stops, and the same routine each time. Nothing too out of the ordinary had ever happened, just the usual traffic and weather. Sure, there were a few strange occurrences over the years, but they never amounted to anything. This trip felt no different. About 20 hours in, a storm rolled in and my progress slowed. It was already late, and I was looking for the next rest stop to catch a few hours of sleep. As I was driving, a bright light appeared in my rearview mirror. The road was flat and straight, so I should have seen it coming. But this light appeared so suddenly, it caught me off guard. It wasn't until it was right behind me that I could even make out the shape of the vehicle. They must have just turned on their headlights, but they quickly closed the gap, getting so close that all I could see were their lights reflected off the back of my trailer. Then, their lights went out. At that point, I kept my speed steady, but I couldn't stop checking my mirrors. With the storm and the way they had pulled up so suddenly, I was more than a little concerned. Whoever turned off their lights in such a heavy storm and tailed so closely was making me nervous. Thankfully, a sign ahead indicated a truck stop was only 5 miles away, so I hoped that whatever was going on would end soon. Still, as a trucker, you can't help but wonder if something like this might be an attempt at a robbery, especially when you're driving alone late at night. The next 5 miles were uneventful, and I started feeling a little less anxious, even though I couldn't see anything in the storm. As I pulled into the truck stop, I checked my mirrors again, but with the rain and poor visibility, it was hard to tell if they had followed. The truck stop was nearly empty, except for a couple of trucks by the gas pumps. I parked off to the side and took a moment to gather myself before opening the door to check around. The rain had soaked me within seconds, but from what I could tell, there wasn't a vehicle anywhere behind me. I locked the truck door, grabbed my pillow and blanket from the passenger side, and tried to relax. The rain pounding on the roof made it easy to drift off to sleep, and I let the sounds of the storm block out any noises from other trucks pulling in and out. When I woke up, it felt like I had only been asleep for a few minutes. It was still dark, and the storm had intensified. I hadn't even had the chance to check my mirrors when a loud bang shook the truck. I froze, my heart racing, and quickly grabbed the door handle. When I opened it, I could barely make out the shape of a car with its headlights off. 2 figures were moving around in front of it. I was too terrified to step out and confront them. Just as I sat there, still processing, the truck door was suddenly slammed against my chest, pushing me back into the driver's seat. A man was standing outside, yelling for me to stay put, then slammed the door again. I saw his hand tucked into his hoodie pocket, and I knew I wasn't in a good situation. With 2 other men now behind the truck, I knew I was completely outnumbered. The truck was shaking as they watched me through the window, their eyes never leaving me. The whole situation felt like it lasted forever, but it couldn't have been more than a few minutes. Finally, the men ran back to their car and drove off, leaving me in shock as I watched them disappear into the storm. I immediately called the police and filed a report, but there was never any follow-up on who the men were or what they wanted. I don't know what would have happened if I hadn't stayed alert. but I'm sure if I had tried to drive off without paying attention, things could have turned out much worse. My house was empty for the week since my roommate was away, and it was spring break, so my classes were on pause too. With no plans for Monday, I found myself stuck inside because of a massive storm hitting our city. This type of weather wasn't unusual for this time of year, but every time it happened, it felt worse. The trees were bending sideways, and the house groaned as the wind howled. Knowing I wouldn't be able to get any rest, I decided to stay up. I grabbed the Xbox controller and started playing one of my favorite games, losing track of time. It must have been around 12 a.m. when the doorbell rang. I paused the game, unsure what to make of it. With the storm raging outside, who would be out there? I went over to the front door and peeked through the peephole. Nothing. I opened the door and the rain hit me hard, but I didn't see anyone. I closed the door, thinking maybe the wind had somehow made the doorbell ring on its own. It sounded ridiculous, but I didn't know what else to think. I returned to my game, but just a few minutes later I heard a loud crash from the backyard. Something had fallen over and broken. I immediately realized it was our patio furniture and rushed to the back door. Outside, everything was scattered across the yard, being tossed by the wind. I grabbed my shoes and went outside to gather the pieces, each one being pushed by the strong wind. It hurt at times when the rain hit my face. I hurried as fast as I could, and that's when I saw someone standing at the edge of the yard, watching me. I froze for a second, but quickly grabbed the last piece of furniture and ran back inside, trying to get away from the rain. When I looked out the back door as I dried off, the person had disappeared. Between the strange doorbell and the figure outside, I started to feel uneasy. I decided to sit in the living room, scrolling through my phone to distract myself. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I grabbed a blanket to lie down on the couch. I didn't want to go upstairs. The storm was even louder up there. After some time, I finally managed to drift off to sleep. A few hours later, I woke up suddenly from a burst of strong wind outside shaking the house. I threw off the blanket and sat up, planning to check on the furniture outside. But when my feet hit the floor, they were soaked. I looked down to find a puddle right next to the couch. Then, I noticed more puddles, leading a trail across the floor. And inside those puddles were faint, muddy footprints. I jumped up and rushed to the far corner of the room, my mind racing. After a moment of hearing nothing but the storm outside, I quietly followed the footprints. They led through the house, up and down the stairs. It was clear the person had entered through the back door, which I'd foolishly forgotten to lock in my rush to get out of the rain. I quickly locked it and grabbed my phone to dial 911. But then, a chilling thought crossed my mind. What if they were still inside? I stayed still, trying to hide as best as I could, then called the police. I waited in silence until they arrived. When they checked the house, they saw everything I had, but no one had taken anything. They said it seemed like a targeted incident, like someone had focused entirely on my house. They told me it didn't make sense. If the person had wanted to harm me, they would have done it when they were so close to me while I was sleeping. After thinking about it for a while, I realized they must have been looking for my roommate. They saw me, checked the place, and then left without doing anything. It felt like a personal attack, but I couldn't shake the feeling that if my roommate had been there, things might have gone much differently. It was during a solo trip I was taking back from visiting some friends for the weekend. Normally I prefer flying, but this time I decided to take the plane. Normally I prefer flying, But this year, the tickets are ridiculous, over $1,000 for a round trip, and that was just to a nearby state. I'd made all my plans, expecting to be back a few days before I had to work, but a massive snowstorm rolled in on the day I was supposed to leave, forcing me to stay an extra couple of days. Finally, I hit the road, and with the post-holiday calm, the highways were nearly deserted. The first few hours weren't bad at all. It's easy to zone out when you're just driving, but the snow kept me sharp. By the time it was around 10 p.m., I was getting close to my next stop, a small town with a hotel only about 2 hours away. But then, something unusual happened. I noticed a set of headlights in my rearview mirror, the first set I'd seen in quite a while. They started getting closer, fast. At first, I thought the driver was just speeding, but as they pulled up, I saw it was a large van. There was no room for me to pull over, and I figured they'd just pass me, until they didn't. Instead, they matched my speed and stayed right behind me. For the next several minutes, the van stayed at my bumper, as if it had no intention of going anywhere. It was a long stretch of road with no other cars around, and their close proximity started to make me uneasy. The exit for the gas station came up, and I decided to turn off, hoping that the van would just continue ahead. But they followed me off the ramp and into the gas station, parking directly behind me. Now I was starting to feel really uncomfortable. Maybe I was overthinking it, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I parked at the pump, and the van did the same. I sat there for a second, unsure of what to do. There was no one else in the station. Half the lights were off, and there was a closed sign hanging on the door. Outside, there was just snow and an empty field stretching out, with nothing in sight but a road cutting through the dark. I glanced in my rearview mirror and saw a man getting out of the van, walking around to pump gas. I started filling up my own car, trying to stay calm. But then the man finished, walked toward the back of the van, and suddenly, I heard the sound of the rear door opening. There was something about the moment that made my instincts flare. Something told me I needed to leave. I yanked the pump from my car, and before I even had a chance to start the engine, 3 men came running toward me from the back of the van. I jumped into my car, slammed the door shut, and locked it just as one of the men grabbed the handle, trying to open it. My heart was racing, and I didn't waste any time. I quickly shoved the car into drive, but as I looked up, I saw them running back to their van and speeding off in the opposite direction. It was like they'd decided I wasn't worth the trouble. I immediately called the police to report what had happened, but never heard back. Looking back, it's obvious they were trying to pull something shady, maybe even abducting people on that isolated stretch of road. What's terrifying is how calculated they were. The whole thing seemed so practiced. As soon as they realized I was safely locked in my car, they didn't even hesitate. They just left, like they had done this many times before. I'll never know exactly what their plan was, but I feel incredibly lucky. I urge anyone who's traveling alone, especially at night, to stay vigilant. Trust your instincts, because not everyone out there has good intentions. In 2018, I spent a weekend with my uncle at his remote farmhouse while my parents were busy with renovations on our new home. It was a Saturday night, and I had been there for 2 days. The weather was fierce, one of the most intense storms I had ever experienced. There were constant bursts of thunder and lightning, at least 3 times a minute. The storm felt like it was right on top of us. I've always found storms soothing when I'm inside, so I stayed up a little later than usual, watching TV and enjoying the atmosphere. Once the movie ended, I turned off the TV and tried to sleep. Just as I started to relax, a bright flash of lightning lit up the room, and I distinctly heard a loud metallic thud from outside. I brushed it off, not thinking much of it. But then, 20 seconds later, I heard it again. Another metallic sound, sharp and clear, just as the lightning flashed. It was so precise that it seemed to match the timing of the storm. Honestly, I didn't want to make it sound like a typical horror story, but my uncle had always been a bit of an oddball, and we were never really close. I wasn't comfortable waking him up over something like this, so I tried to ignore it. But after a third sound, I couldn't let it go. I had to find out what it was. I got out of bed and made my way over to the guest bedroom window. The rain was coming down heavily, and the water streaming down the glass made it almost impossible to see anything. Then, another flash of lightning revealed a brief view of the property. I still couldn't see much, but the sound of the metal hitting something was louder this time, and it seemed to come from the left side of the window, just out of my direct line of sight. I decided I couldn't just sit there anymore. I wasn't sure my uncle would approve of what I was about to do, but I needed to know what was going on. It would be a little messy, but I slid open the window to take a closer look. The moment the window opened, the wind from the storm rushed in and raindrops soaked me. I stuck my head out, squinting into the storm. Lightning flashed again, and in that brief moment of light, I saw a figure crouching near the basement door. The person was dressed entirely in black, and their hand was raised as if they were striking something. I barely had time to react before the lightning faded, and everything went dark again. I quickly pulled my head back inside and locked the window, panic setting in. I was afraid they might have seen or heard me. I hurried back to bed, pretending to be asleep and facing away from the window. Another lightning strike lit up the room, but this time, the familiar metallic sound didn't follow. My stomach dropped as I realized the person had stopped whatever they were doing. I stayed frozen in bed, hoping they'd leave. After several more flashes of lightning, with no thudding sounds, I thought it might be safe to tell my uncle. I turned to face the window, only to find a figure standing right there looking in at me. I screamed as loud as I could and bolted for my uncle's room. He grabbed his rifle and rushed outside, still in his pajamas with no shoes on. He searched the property, yelling out, but found nothing. The next morning, we examined the basement door lock. It was clear the door had been tampered with, and the lock was nearly broken. According to my uncle, a few more hits, and it would have given way completely. He was impressed I'd noticed it. I was relieved to leave that day, and I haven't heard anything about that kind of incident from my uncle since. We don't really stay in touch much, but I'm glad I stayed up that night to watch that movie. I may have prevented something much worse from happening.